Hello everyone, it's Kaylin Shuchuk and Shewy Photography back with another video. Today we're going to talk about some camera basics and how to shoot manually. So on that note, let's get into it. So how to shoot manually. I know this can be a pretty scary topic for a lot of people. For me, when I first started out photography, I know it was pretty daunting with it seeming like a lot of information thrown at you, but we can narrow down how to shoot manually to 4 topics: ISO, white balance, shutter speed, and aperture. So let's jump into some examples. So first let's start with ISO. So ISO is basically how much artificial light your camera is introducing into your picture. So this picture, for example, is shot at 200 ISO, and the lower the ISO, the less artificial light is in your picture. So, but also with ISO, the higher your number goes up, the less quality and the more grainy your picture is going to be. So this picture shot at 200 ISO, and you can see it's pretty crisp here. But now if we look at our next picture, this is shot at 25,600 ISO, and you can see how grainy the picture is. So why would you bump up your ISO? Bumping up your ISO can help when you're in tough light situations, like if you're shooting at dark and you need more light to be able to capture a picture, because a picture in general is better than no picture at all. Other situations where you need to bump up your ISO is if you're doing like star photography, like shooting stars, like astrophotography, stuff like that. Or if you're also shooting videos and you need to keep your shutter speed at a certain number, you have to bump up that ISO a little bit just to make sure everything is exposed right. So white balance. So white balance is measured in Kelvin. It's just a type of measurement. But what you need to know about it and focus on is that if you have a lower number on the Kelvin scale, your picture, for example, like this one, is going to be more cool and more blue toned. Where if you have a higher number in Kelvin, your picture is going to be warmer, more yellow and oranges. So this was shot on my camera on the fluorescent setting, and the temperature is 3300 Kelvin. Let's look at the next picture. This one, however, was shot on the shadow function in my camera, and its temperature in Kelvin is 6700. So you can see the big difference in kind of just the way the picture looks just by shooting on a different white balance. So what does this mean for you? So on all cameras, there's a WB button somewhere on your camera. This adjusts your white balance. So if you want to start out, you can shoot in auto, and this means the camera detects the scene for you and chooses what it thinks the best white balance is for your shot. But there are automatic settings in the white balance button as well, whereas like a fluorescent bulb, which is like a cooler tone, there's a sun, which is going to be a warmer tone, there's a cloud, and then there's like shade on mine as well, and these all adjust the white balance just a little bit. So what I suggest is just play around with those functions, take the same picture in each different white balance and see what it does to your picture, and just play around with it, and you'll get used to what emblem you need for what picture you're shooting. So let's talk about aperture now. So aperture is a little bit backwards. The lower your aperture is, or your f-stop number, the more light that's going to be let in through your lens into your camera, and the higher number your f-stop is, the less light that's going to be let in through your lens into your camera for pictures. So I'm going to put up a picture of what an f-stop of 1.8 looks like compared to an f-stop of 22. So as you can see in these two pictures, the first one is an aperture of 1.8, and you can see how wide open the lens is. Like you can see like basically straight through it. And then the second picture, this is an f-stop of 22, so you can see how small that hole is of light getting let through. So how does this affect your pictures? So it has 2 different effects on your pictures. So first we're going to look at a picture where everything else is left the same, but we're going to shoot the picture at an f-stop of 2.8. And you can see how bright this picture is. Next we're going to take the same picture shot at f22. and now you can see how dark this is. So this is the first way that Aperture affects your pictures, is going to be how much light it lets in, and you need to kind of adjust this to get that picture as close to zero exposure. So next we're going to look at the other way Aperture affects your pictures, which is this. This is also shot at 2.8, but this time I changed the shutter speed to match this, so we're at a zero exposure level, and you can see what it did to the background. It made it all blurry. So this is what we call bokeh. So the picture of what I'm focusing on, which is this kind of stocky plant thing, it's super and crisp, but everything behind it's really blurry. So this is one way you can add depth to your shot to make it, whatever your subject is, stand out. And then this is the same setup, but this time I shot at f18 and adjusted the shutter speed so we're at a zero exposure, and now you can see everything is in focus, from the picture, from the plant in the front all the way to the house in the back. Everything is in focus. So what you do with your aperture can affect how your picture turns out and what it looks like and what you're going for. So when you're taking portraits and stuff like that, it's nice to have a really low f-stop number so you can get that bokeh, so your subject or your person is in focus, and the focus and everything is focused on that person and not distracted by the background. But if you're shooting landscape and stuff like that, you want a little bit higher of the f-stop number, so whenever you're focusing on the foreground, it's also the stuff in the background is sharp as well. So if there was like a picture where you had something that was in the foreground that looked really cool, but you had mountains in the background, you want a little bit higher of an f-stop number so the mountains in the background are also in focus. So next we're going to talk about shutter speed. So shutter speed is basically how fast your shutter is opening and closing, and that affects how much light is also let into your camera. So a shutter speed has to mirror what f-stop you're at in order to get that exposure to zero. So this first picture is a picture that's perfectly exposed at zero. So our f-stop's 5.6 and our shutter speed is 1/80. So shutter speeds are measured 1 over a number. So the lower that number is, the longer your shutter speed is going to be open for, because it's 1 over, for example, 20 is 1/20th of a second, compared to if your number is close to like 250 or like 2000, that means 1 over 250 or 2000, which means 1/200th of a second or 1/2000th of a second. So in this first picture, everything we're using a 1/80 second shutter speed and an f of 5.6, and the picture is evenly exposed. But next we're going to look at a picture that the f-stop is 5.6, but our shutter speed is 1/2500th of a second. And you can see how dark the picture is and how underexposed it is, just because it's how quick that shutter speed is opening and closing, that there's not enough light let into the picture, and you get this. So the other extreme is, this is 1/10th of a second with an aperture of 5.6. So the shutter speed was left open for 1/10th of a second, and it lets in a lot more light, and the picture is now overexposed. So what's the reason for different shutter speeds? So one example is something like this, where my shutter speed was 1/10th of a second, and it was too slow to capture the movement of this person moving their arm, for example. So it's all blurry. So if you're shooting portraits and stuff like that, it's good to have a higher shutter speed. So if your subject's moving and stuff like that, you can capture their movements pinpoint and it doesn't have a motion blur like this. So if we look at this next picture, I shot this at 1/500th of a second of the person do the exact same arm movement, and it captured it exactly without any motion blur. So some ways that shutter speed can affect your picture is in landscape, for example, if you're shooting water, you want a really long long shutter speed. So like you want it to almost get down to like a second if possible, because then it really smooths out the water. So an example of that is this. So you can see how smooth that water is. Another example is waterfalls or moving water. If you shoot it at a super high shutter speed, the water looks choppy and like you're freezing that frame. But if you're able to extend that shutter speed out a little bit, it becomes more smooth, something like this. What does this all mean for you? So at the bottom of your camera, there's a bar where there's a 0 in the middle, and then a +1, a +2, a +3 on one side, and -1, -2, -3 on the other side. This is your exposure bar. So what we're trying to do is get that number as close to 0 as possible. This means your picture is evenly exposed, and this is what we're aiming for in our photos for the most part. There's some kind of workarounds around this depending on if you're trying to shoot like sunsets and stuff like that. You might lean more to a -1 or a -0.7, somewhere in that range, just because you don't want the sky where all the colors are to be overexposed and blown out. But for the most part, we're going to just aim for getting your shot to a 0. And then so you need to use what we talked about with the f-stop and the shutter speed and the ISO to get that number to 0. But again, there's different circumstances to use different numbers in your f-stop. So if you are shooting a portrait picture and you want that bokeh, then you're going to have that lower f-stop number, like a 2.8 or a 1.8, wherever your lens can get down to. Most lens that you get with your camera, like a stock lens, it goes down to a 4.0, which you can still get some decent bokeh with. But if that number is going to be on the lower side, again, that means more light's going to be let in. And if that's the case, then we're going to have to bump up that shutter speed in order to offset it. And vice versa, if you want that long shutter speed, like a 1 second or something like that, to smooth out water, then we are going to have to bump up that f-stop number to close, maybe take 20, somewhere in there. You can buy a filter, which also cuts out some of the light to allow you to have a longer shutter speed, but we'll talk about filters in a different video. So yeah, I would say you just got to go out and just play around with your camera, test out the different ranges in your f-stop, what the lower ones does, what the higher ones do, and same with your shutter speed. If you're trying to capture movement, you always want a higher shutter speed to be able to capture that so there's not motion blur. And yeah, so I hope you guys liked this video and it helped you out, and hopefully you're not as scared to switch into that manual mode and shoot, because it's a lot more fun than just being in auto and letting the camera do everything. And this way you can make that picture be exactly what you want. So if you like this video and you thought it was helpful, please hit that like button. Also comment on what I can improve on, or if there's anything you think you want me to tackle next. And please subscribe as well if you like this channel, and I will catch you on the next video. Bye.